White woman calls police on black teen boy, speechless when his mum arrives and she's the mayor. Have you ever witnessed a moment so unexpected that it turned an ordinary afternoon upside down, revealing truths about prejudice, power, and unforeseen connections? This story begins on a lazy Saturday in a quiet suburban neighborhood where a tense encounter between a white woman and a black teenager captured everyone's attention. But no one anticipated how one phone call could spiral into a life-changing event, especially when the teenager's mother arrived on the scene and turned out to be the mayor. Emotions will run high, secrets will be laid bare, and by the end, no one will ever see their community the same way again. Springdale was a charming town known for its tree-lined streets, old Victorian homes, and a bustling downtown area featuring a cozy cafe called Millie's Bake Shop, a local bookstore, and even a popular Starbucks on the corner of Main and Willow. It was a Saturday morning in late spring, and the gentle warmth of the sun promised a lovely day ahead. Neighbors often took pride in their tidy front lawns and blossoming flower beds, competing for the coveted annual Springdale's Best Garden Award. Andre Thompson, a lanky 14-year-old boy with a head full of tight curls and an irrepressible grin, had just finished his weekly track practice at the local high school, Thomas Jefferson High. The wind was still clinging to the scent of freshly cut grass from the football field as Andre walked through the neighborhood toward home. His mind buzzed with excitement about the upcoming summer break. He'd made the varsity track team as a freshman, a remarkable achievement. Though the rest of his classmates seemed to focus solely on grades or typical teenage drama, Andre found solace and confidence in his athletic pursuits. He was also known for his inquisitive mind. At home, he often buried himself in comics and computer games, sometimes staying up past midnight, devouring fantasy novels. On this particular Saturday, he wore his favorite school hoodie and carried a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He planned to make a quick stop at the convenience store near Willow Street to grab an energy drink before heading home. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. In fact, the slight bounce in his step reflected how carefree he felt that day. Fate, however, had something else in store for him. Across the street, Margaret Holcomb, a middle-aged woman with short, meticulously styled blonde hair, stepped out onto her porch. She had moved to Springdale 5 years earlier, hoping to find a close-knit community. Yet, her interactions with neighbors had grown limited over time. Something about her hinted at a deep well of anxiety that she rarely admitted. She fussed over small changes in the neighborhood and often eyed newcomers with suspicion. That morning, she watched Andre strolling down the street. She didn't recognize him from the block he lived across town, in a more diverse area. To Margaret, the sight of a strange face in a hoodie triggered her anxieties. She found herself stepping to the edge of her porch, a gnawing discomfort stirring in her stomach. Perhaps it was because she'd read one too many sensationalized headlines, or because her social circle validated quick assumptions, but her mind leapt to dire conclusions. Andre noticed her staring but tried to ignore it. He kept walking, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag. Margaret's suspicion only deepened when she saw what appeared to be a bulge in his hoodie pocket. In truth, it was just the corner of his phone, but her biases projected something more dangerous. Her heart rate quickened, and she fumbled for her own phone. The warm morning light seemed to fade around Margaret as she dialed 911. She reported seeing a suspicious individual lurking around. By the time she finished the call, her breath was shaky. Deep down, part of her wondered if she was overreacting, but she could not quell the mounting anxiety. Ignorance and prejudice coalesced in a single impulsive act, one phone call that would soon reverberate throughout Springdale. Andre was blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding behind him. He continued on, rounding the corner toward the convenience store. Meanwhile, the dispatcher alerted the Springdale Police Department, describing a tall, young black male in a hoodie, possibly armed. Officers in the vicinity were instructed to respond. In the heart of downtown, nestled between a family-owned pizzeria and City Hall, stood the mayor's office. Mayor Alicia Thompson had spent the early morning reviewing proposals to renovate the dilapidated community center. She was a poised, compassionate leader with a clear vision for Springdale's future. Known for her tireless advocacy on education and youth programs, Alicia was no stranger to the complexities of bridging diverse neighborhoods. In fact, it was her mission to ensure that Springdale's charm was accessible and welcoming to all. Little did she know that only a few blocks away, her own son would soon be caught in a maelstrom. The mayor's staff had just scheduled a meeting to discuss the upcoming charity 5K event. Alicia had spearheaded to fund scholarships for students in lower-income areas. She planned to swing by home first to share some lunch with her husband, David, before returning to City Hall. Outside, the police cruisers roared to life. Sergeant Michael Caldwell, a seasoned officer, was among the first responders. He had grown up in Springdale, had walked its streets and played basketball in the public parks. Although familiar with nearly everyone in town, he didn't immediately connect the suspicious individual called to the mayor's kid. The description was too vague, and also, Andre wasn't typically seen in that neighborhood. Margaret, peeking through her living room window, saw 2 police vehicles speed by. A strange mixture of relief and apprehension swept over her. She wanted assurance that everything would be taken care of, but she also didn't realize the potential consequences of her hasty allegations. Part of her, though she might never admit it, felt a thrill at having the power to make the authorities respond. Andre stopped at the convenience store. The manager greeted him warmly. They recognized each other because Andre often bought sports drinks after practice. He reached into his pocket for a few dollars. While paying, he fished out his phone to check the time, noticing a text from his mom asking if he'd be home soon. He texted back, "On my way now. Practice was good. See you soon." Swinging the door open, he stepped back onto the street. Just then, he spotted an elderly man, Mr. Riley, standing by the curb, struggling to load groceries into his trunk. Andre's parents had always taught him to help neighbors when possible. Remembering Mr. Riley from church events, Andre jogged over, offering to lift the heavier bags. Grateful, Mr. Riley smiled widely. "Thank you, young man. My back isn't what it used to be." Andre helped place the bags carefully. Unbeknownst to them, 2 police cruisers were turning onto the street. One slowed to a crawl, the other parked at the corner. When Andre looked up, he saw the officers exit their vehicles, hands on their belts. At first, he paid little attention, thinking they were on a routine patrol, but the tension on their faces hinted otherwise. One officer, a younger recruit named Officer Peters, called out in a firm voice, "Excuse me, son. We need to talk to you for a minute." Mr. Riley glanced at the officers, confused. "Is something the matter?" "Sir, please step aside," Peters insisted, his tone measured but urgent. That's when Andre realized that the conversation was about him. His stomach tightened. He glanced around, unsure how a simple act of kindness, helping an elderly neighbor, could draw police attention. Meanwhile, Sergeant Caldwell approached more slowly. He recognized Andre's face from the mayor's election campaign photos. He had seen the mayor's family at various community events. But with the radio chatter from dispatch describing a potentially armed suspect, Caldwell couldn't dismiss the situation. Duty demanded verification, but experience told him to tread carefully. "Young man," Caldwell said, arms raised in a placating gesture, "we've had a report of suspicious activity. We need to ask you a few questions." Suspicious activity," Andre stammered, clearly taken aback. "I was just getting a drink and helping Mr. Riley here." Mr. Riley tried to interject. "Officers, I've known this boy. He's no trouble." There must be some misunderstanding, yet the officers had a procedure to follow. The tension was palpable, and the scene began to draw the attention of passers-by. Some whispered among themselves. Others pulled out their phones to record. A mild hush fell over the block, a far cry from the pleasant hum of a typical Springdale morning. Yet no one knew the full scale of the storm about to break. Andrei's heart pounded in his chest. He took a cautious step back, suddenly aware that any movement could be misconstrued. He'd heard his parents' talks about dealing with the police. Keep your hands visible, remain calm, comply with instructions. Even so, fear and adrenaline coursed through him. Officer Peters, who was still relatively new to the force, felt the weight of the call's description. He noticed the outline in Andrei's hoodie pocket, still suspecting it might be a weapon. Nervously, he reached for his service weapon, unclipping the holster's retention strap. Seeing the move, Sergeant Caldwell swiftly placed a hand on Peters's shoulder. Easy. Let's not jump to conclusions. Caldwell's calm demeanor contrasted Peters's agitation, but the younger officer's posture remained tense. Could you empty your pockets, please? Caldwell asked Andrei, voice steady. We just want to make sure everything is all right. Andrei swallowed hard, carefully lifting out his phone and some loose change. He raised his hoodie to show there was nothing else inside. Feeling thoroughly embarrassed, yet still frightened, he took another step back, hoping to God that this situation wouldn't escalate further. The crowd on the sidewalk grew. People whispered that this was Alicia Thompson's son. Could it be? A few onlookers edged closer, hoping to intervene but uncertain how to do so safely. Meanwhile, Mr. Riley tried to assert that Andrei was innocent, but the officers seemed bound to follow through on the complaint. Margaret Holcomb had quietly followed the commotion from a distance. She recognized Andrei and realized with a jolt that he was simply helping someone with groceries. In that moment, a pang of guilt started to gnaw at her. Perhaps she had acted too rashly. But fear and denial are stubborn forces, and Margaret fought the urge to step forward and rectify the situation. Instead, she lingered near a lamppost, anxiously shifting her weight. Another part of her was still convinced that something must have been off about the teenager. Why else would she have felt so threatened? Inside City Hall, Alicia Thompson was wrapping up her meeting when her phone buzzed again. Her aide, Jasmine, rushed in, eyes wide with alarm. "Madam Mayor," Jasmine said breathlessly, "there's something going on with Andrei. The police are detaining him over on Willow Street." Alicia's stomach dropped. Her first instinct was disbelief, followed by alarm. She grabbed her car keys and purse in one swift motion, instructing Jasmine to come with her. As they dashed out the door, Alicia tried to call her husband, David, but the call went straight to voicemail. She left a quick, urgent message. Within minutes, Alicia and Jasmine navigated through the town streets. They passed the Starbucks, where Alicia recalled taking Andrei for hot chocolate on winter mornings. Every memory added to the surreal feeling that her son could be in trouble. Approaching Willow Street, she saw flashing blue lights and a small crowd gathering. As soon as she parked, Alicia jumped out of her car and ran toward the cluster of onlookers. Gasps and murmurs spread among the crowd, and then a hushed silence fell. The mayor's authority in Springdale was well-respected. People parted to let her through. There he was, Andrei, standing rigidly, eyes brimming with fear and confusion as he confronted the officers. The moment Alicia saw him, her protective instincts kicked in. She was no longer just the mayor, she was a mother, desperate to shield her son. "Andrei," she called out, voice trembling. She pushed through until she stood between her son and the officers. "What is going on here?" Sergeant Caldwell's eyes flickered with recognition. He'd worked with Mayor Thompson on community safety initiatives. He quickly signaled Officer Peters to step back. "Mayor Thompson," he started, "there's been a call about suspicious activity. We're just following up." Alicia's face tightened with anger as she glared at Peters, who still had his hand near his holster. "Lower your weapon," she demanded. The younger officer complied immediately, looking both stunned and embarrassed. For a moment, the entire crowd held its breath. Alicia's gaze fell on her son. "Andre, are you all right?" she asked, softening her tone slightly, seeing he was visibly shaken. He nodded. "I'm okay, Mum. I didn't do anything. I was helping Mr. Riley." Mayor Thompson turned back to Caldwell. "This is my son. I want to know exactly who made the call and why my child was harassed on a public street while helping an elderly neighbor." Caldwell swallowed. He understood the gravity of the situation, not just because Alicia was the mayor, but because a serious wrong appeared to have been committed. "We received a call from a resident claiming a suspicious person might be armed. We responded accordingly, but it looks like it was a false alarm." Alicia's eyes swept the small crowd, and she spotted Margaret Holcomb, half hidden behind a lamppost. Something about her demeanor made it painfully clear that she was involved. Alicia felt a wave of anger, but she also knew her position demanded composure. One wrong move, and she might compromise the very values she stood for. "Come here," she beckoned Margaret. Voice measured yet firm, the woman froze, her face paling. She realized there was no retreat. With hesitant steps, she approached, all eyes upon her. Margaret stepped forward, hands clasped nervously. She glanced at Andre, who stared back, his expression a mix of hurt and confusion. Alicia placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. The onlookers seemed glued in place, sensing that a pivotal confrontation was at hand. "Did you call the police on my son?" Alicia asked Margaret, voice low but tinged with frustration. Margaret opened her mouth, but words failed her at first. After a moment, she forced them out, her voice shaking. I saw him walking in the neighborhood. I didn't know who he was." He looked suspicious. "I was afraid." "You were afraid," Alicia repeated, her tone carrying the disbelief of someone who has seen this scenario too many times. The mayor knew from personal experience that fear often came from ignorance or prejudice, and this was no exception. Afraid of a 14-year-old boy in a hoodie, walking home from track practice. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I thought he had a weapon. I didn't want to risk it." Andre, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Why would you think that about me?" "I wasn't doing anything wrong." His voice cracked. "I was carrying my phone and some change for a drink." Margaret looked down, unable to meet his gaze. The silence that followed seemed to stretch infinitely. Passers-by recorded the moment on their cell phones, capturing every uncomfortable second. Alicia inhaled deeply, trying to remain calm. This isn't the first time someone has judged a child, my child, based on the color of his skin and a hoodie. But I promise you this, it will be the last time you get away with such a baseless accusation in this town. Though her words were composed, the tremor in her voice revealed her underlying rage and heartbreak. Sergeant Caldwell gently cleared his throat. "Mayor Thompson, we'll need you both, Miss Holcomb and you, to give statements so we can officially close out the incident." He was acutely aware of the delicate balance between legal procedure and the high emotions swirling around. Margaret nodded, still looking mortified. Alicia guided Andre away from the police cars, pressing him close in a comforting embrace. At that moment, David Thompson arrived, having finally checked his voicemail. He sprinted across the street, eyes wide with panic, until he saw Alicia and Andre together. Relief washed over him, but his face was etched with concern. He locked eyes with Margaret, struggling to comprehend how someone could do this to his son. But before any heated words could be exchanged, Alicia gently took David's hand, signaling that the priority was to calm Andre down and address the situation in a constructive, albeit firm, manner. After statements were given to the officers, Margaret's voice shaking as she recounted her supposed fears, and Alicia's measured anger simmering beneath every word, Alicia insisted on taking the matter to City Hall. She wanted an official record of the bias incident and demanded that the police report reflect the truth, that Andre was doing nothing illegal or suspicious when the call was placed. Springdale City Hall was housed in a grand, neoclassical building with towering columns and a carefully manicured lawn. Alicia led Andre and David up the front steps. Margaret followed at a distance, unsure of whether she should leave or stay. Something compelled her to keep going, perhaps the nagging guilt in her conscience. She was also mindful that fleeing the scene might worsen her standing. Inside, the marble floors and high ceilings lent an air of solemnity to the proceedings. Sergeant Caldwell met them in a private conference room, where an official from the mayor's office also awaited. The mood was tense, though the subdued lighting and muted decor offered a semblance of calm. Alicia turned to Margaret. "Do you understand the gravity of what you did?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "You called the police on a child, my child, for no valid reason. You told them he might be armed. Do you realize what could have happened if a different officer had responded, someone who might have acted aggressively first and asked questions later?" Margaret lowered her head. "I'm sorry. I see now that I overreacted." "Overreacted," David repeated, scoffing bitterly. "That's one way to put it." Margaret winced. "I let my fear take over. I didn't think." Alicia steadied herself. "This is bigger than you and me. It's about how deeply ingrained biases can lead to dangerous outcomes. Do you see that?" She paused, letting her question hang. Margaret, trembling, nodded weakly. "I'm not just the mayor, I'm the mother of a black son, and I refuse to let these unfounded biases threaten his safety." Margaret's eyes darted to Andre, who stood quietly by his father's side. His face was stoic, but the hurt was evident in his eyes. She wanted to apologize directly, but the lump in her throat was too large for words. Sergeant Caldwell cleared his throat to break the silence. "Madam Mayor, Miss Holcomb's statement has been taken. Unless you wish to press charges, we can treat this as a non-criminal bias complaint, though it will remain on record. We can also refer Miss Holcomb to the Springdale Mediation and Reconciliation Program, where she can learn—" "Yes," Alicia interrupted, "I want her to go through that program, and she should publicly apologize to Andre." Alicia then turned to Margaret, who looked startled at the mention of a public apology. "Actions have consequences," the mayor continued. "It's not enough to say you're sorry in private." Margaret felt cornered, but also recognized the damage she'd caused. She forced herself to meet Andre's gaze. "Andre, I am truly sorry," she said, voice quivering. "If I could take it back, I would." Andre bit his lip, trying to decide how to respond. Finally, he simply said, "I appreciate that," in a voice barely above a whisper. He still felt too shaken to say more. Word traveled fast in Springdale. By evening, local news outlets had picked up the story. Springdale mayor's son wrongfully detained after racially biased 911 call. Journalists called the mayor's office for statements, and social media buzzed with outrage, empathy, and every reaction in between. Alicia and David sat in their living room that night, comforting Andre. The day had taken an emotional toll on him. Alicia spoke softly. "Andre, I'm proud of how you handled yourself. It's not fair that you had to go through this, but we're here for you." Andre leaned against his mother. I never thought it would happen to me. Not in Springdale. I always thought this stuff was more like something you read about in big cities." David pressed a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "This can happen anywhere. That's why your mum works so hard to address these issues at their roots." There was a knock at the door, Sergeant. Caldwell had come by, off duty and out of uniform. He wanted to check on Andre personally. When Alicia let him in, he offered a small basket of cookies from Millie's bake shop. "I know this doesn't fix anything," he said, "but I wanted to let you know I'm sorry you experienced that. If there's anything I can do." Alicia nodded, grateful for the gesture. "We appreciate it, Sergeant, we really do." Caldwell turned to Andre. "You've got a strong family, kid. Keep your head up." The next morning, Sunday, Alicia decided to address the congregation at her family's church service. The Reverend offered her the podium after the sermon, and Alicia spoke directly about the hurtful incident that had happened. She asked the congregation to stand up against racial bias, to intervene when they see unfair treatment, and to treat each other with compassion. Margaret Holcomb was not a churchgoer, but word of the mayor's impassioned speech got back to her. She felt more isolated than ever, receiving cold stares from neighbors, and even being asked to skip her usual bridge club at the community center that week. Her social circle seemed to shrink overnight, and she caught wind that people were labeling her as a racist. It was a stark and painful reckoning. 2 weeks later, Margaret entered the modest Springdale Community Center. A sign in front read, "Mediation and Reconciliation Program Today." She felt butterflies in her stomach, uncertain about what to expect. The waiting area was simple folding chairs, a table stacked with pamphlets about conflict resolution, and a large poster reading, "Building Bridges, Not Walls." She was scheduled to participate in a restorative justice session where those who have caused harm due to bias and those who have experienced it could discuss the incident in a controlled environment. Margaret's heart pounded as she realized this meant facing Andre and his parents again. Mayor Thompson had advocated for this approach rather than filing formal charges, believing it could be a way to foster understanding and growth. While Alicia was still furious about the harm done to Andre, she also recognized that punishing Margaret might not be as productive as educating her. David and Andre had agreed to attend, though they were apprehensive. When Margaret saw them enter the room, Andre first, shoulders a bit hunched, and Alicia and David behind him, her breath caught. She wanted to leave, to avoid the confrontation altogether, but she knew that would only worsen the impression people had of her. A coordinator named Paula introduced herself, explaining the ground rules. Everyone would have a chance to speak, to share their feelings, and to ask questions. The goal wasn't to shame, but to heal. They settled in a circle of chairs. Paula started by asking each participant to describe what they felt at the time of the incident. Andre spoke quietly about his shock and fear. Alicia described her anger and sorrow, not just for Andre, but for the countless similar situations across the country. David added that the incident made him question how safe his son truly was, even in their hometown. When it was Margaret's turn, tears welled in her eyes. She admitted that her biases and fears overwhelmed her. "I've had some break-ins in the past," she offered weakly, "and I was scared. I've seen stories on the news about." She trailed off, realizing the excuses only went so far. Paula guided the conversation toward accountability and healing. "Margaret, can you articulate what you want to say to Andre now, after hearing his perspective?" Turning to Andre, Margaret swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. I realize how wrong I was to assume anything about you based on appearance. I had no right to put your life in danger like that." Her voice cracked. "And I understand that an apology isn't enough, but I'm committed to learning, to doing better. I want to ensure this never happens again." Andre looked at Margaret, uncertain of how to respond. Part of him was still angry, another part exhausted, and a small part relieved to see her expressing genuine remorse. "I appreciate your apology," he finally said. "I hope you really mean it." The session continued for over an hour. Alicia stressed the importance of empathy and community education. David emphasized that genuine change requires effort beyond words. By the end, while the tension hadn't magically disappeared, A quiet understanding filled the room like a wound that was finally being cleaned, not healed yet, but on the road to recovery. Following the mediation session, Margaret realized she needed to change her life dramatically. She signed up for a series of workshops at the community center, including an unlearning bias seminar and a building inclusive communities course. She also started volunteering at the local youth club, where she encountered a diverse group of teenagers, many of whom reminded her of Andre. At first, the teens were wary of her. Some recognized her from the incident, as videos and news articles had circulated widely. But Margaret persisted, helping them with art projects, guiding them in cooking lessons, and simply listening to their stories. Slowly, she saw past her old assumptions and began to embrace the perspective she once lacked. She also took another step that was even more daunting. She invited Alicia to coffee at Starbucks. At first, the mayor was reluctant, but after some contemplation, she agreed. They met on a Monday afternoon, choosing a small table in the corner. Nervousness hung in the air like a dense fog. Margaret began. "Mayor Thompson, Alicia, I want to thank you for giving me a second chance. I realize now how damaging my actions were, not just to Andre, but to our entire community." Alicia stirred her latte thoughtfully. "Springdale needs more than just a single apology to fix the issues we face. But I see you making an effort, and that matters." Margaret nodded, tears brimming. "I'm hoping to start a neighborhood watch program with a focus on community building rather than suspicion. Maybe hold monthly meetups so people actually know their neighbors, rather than fearing them." Alicia's eyebrows rose in cautious optimism. "That's not a bad idea. I'd be willing to support it, as long as it's truly about building bridges." The conversation flowed for nearly an hour. When they parted, there was a tentative warmth between them. Alicia was still guarded. This was the woman who'd traumatized her son, but she could see genuine remorse in Margaret's eyes. In time, perhaps, some form of trust could be rebuilt. While Margaret embarked on her journey, Andre faced his own emotional scars. He had trouble sleeping for a while, replaying the police confrontation in his mind. He'd sometimes panic when he saw patrol cars, remembering the officer who nearly unholstered his gun. To help him cope, Alicia and David arranged for him to speak with a counselor, someone experienced in working with teens who've experienced racial profiling. At first, Andre resisted, insisting he was fine, but in the quiet sessions, he opened up about the fear and humiliation he felt. He also found solace in his friends, who rallied around him. His track teammates wore special wristbands that said, "Unity in Springdale." They dedicated their next meet to standing against bias, inviting the local news to cover the event. Andre didn't fully grasp how influential his story would become, but he felt supported, and it gave him a sense of purpose. Maybe by telling his story, he could help ensure fewer kids would experience what he did. Despite Margaret's sincere attempts to make amends, consequences of her actions arrived in various forms. She worked part-time as a real estate agent, but after the incident, several clients cancelled their contracts with her. They cited ethical concerns, unwilling to be represented by someone who had racially profiled a minor. Her boss called her in for a meeting, explaining that her reputation was now hurting the firm. He reluctantly let her go, apologizing but stating that the decision was final. Margaret was devastated, yet she understood. It was karma, or simply the real-world consequences of a grave mistake. The mortgage payment on her suburban home now loomed, and she feared losing it if she couldn't find another job. She applied to various positions and received cold rejections. Word of mouth in Springdale was strong, and few employers wanted the baggage of controversy. Adding to the strain, some of Margaret's closest friends distanced themselves. They insisted they were uncomfortable being associated with her. In truth, they worried about backlash in their own social circles. Margaret felt the sting of social isolation. It was a sobering experience, one that forced her to confront the pain that her actions had inflicted on others. During one tearful evening, she remembered Alicia's emphasis on community. She realized that she had to rebuild her life on new foundations, ones built on empathy, not fear. She reached out to the local NAACP chapter, hoping to volunteer. Some members were initially skeptical, but they listened to her story of remorse and a desire to learn. In a surprising turn, they welcomed her. The organization believed in rehabilitation and recognized that one of the most powerful transformations comes from those who face their biases head-on. The mayor's office decided to host a community forum at the high school auditorium, a place that symbolized the future of Springdale. The event aimed to address racial bias, policing policies, and how to cultivate understanding among residents. Alicia enlisted local leaders, clergy members, law enforcement representatives, and youth advocates to speak. On the evening of the forum, the auditorium filled with a diverse cross-section of the town. Some came to share personal stories, others to listen and learn. Margaret sat in the third row, listening intently. Next to her was a neighbor she rarely spoke to before, an older black woman named Miss S. Jenkins, who had once tried to befriend Margaret but was brushed off. Andre was also present, seated beside his parents. Though still uneasy around large gatherings, he felt it was important to be there. When Alicia stepped to the podium, the crowd hushed. "Good evening, Springdale," she began. "We're here to acknowledge that while our town is a wonderful place to live, we're not immune to the biases and fears that plague our society. My family learned that the hard way when my son, Andre, was profiled for simply walking down the street." She paused, scanning the audience. "We have to do better. As your mayor, I'm committed to policy changes that mandate cultural sensitivity training for all law enforcement and local government employees. I also plan to expand mentorship programs for youth so we can foster connections across neighborhoods." The audience applauded, some standing in agreement. Alicia invited Sergeant Caldwell to share the new guidelines the police department was implementing, including revised protocols for responding to 911 calls that allege suspicious activity with limited or vague evidence. Finally, Alicia welcomed anyone from the audience to speak. A few residents rose and spoke about their experiences of bias or witnessing it. Then, surprisingly, Margaret stood. Her hands shook as she held the microphone. "My name is Margaret Holcomb," she began, voice trembling. "I'm the woman who called 911 on Andre Thompson. I'm here to own up to my mistake and to publicly apologize once more, not only to Andre and Mayor Thompson, but to the entire community. I let my fears overshadow my empathy. I was wrong." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Miss S. Jenkins, seated beside Margaret, gently patted her shoulder. A few others nodded in quiet acceptance. Margaret held back tears. "I lost my job, and many friends turned away from me. I can't blame them. But I'm determined to earn back the trust I lost by working to promote understanding and inclusion." A handful of people began clapping, and soon more joined. It wasn't an overwhelming standing ovation, but it was a respectful acknowledgement of her willingness to change. Margaret handed back the microphone and sat down, exhaling in relief. As weeks turned into months, Springdale continued to adjust. The new community policing policies took shape, and officers underwent comprehensive training. The town also established a cultural liaison committee, ensuring representation from all neighborhoods in policy decisions. Andre returned to his daily routine track meets, homework, hanging out with friends. He felt a palpable shift in how people treated him. More neighbors greeted him warmly, as if to make up for Margaret's mistake. Yet he remained cautious, aware that one incident of overt bias had opened his eyes to many subtler forms around him. Margaret, meanwhile, dove headlong into community work. She led a block party, ironically on the same street where she'd first seen Andre. The event featured food trucks, a small stage for local performers, and booths that provided resources for youth programs. She was pleasantly surprised to find so many residents willing to come out. Some greeted her politely, others a bit warily, but by the end of the day, the atmosphere felt lighter, almost celebratory. Mayor Thompson made an appearance at the block party, further solidifying the spirit of reconciliation. At one point, Alicia and Margaret ended up chatting by the grilled corn stand. They spoke about the next steps for the Neighborhood Watch initiative. Alicia offered to connect Margaret with city resources to help. It was a conversation that, a few months prior, neither woman could have imagined having. Autumn arrived, painting Springdale's trees in vibrant oranges and reds. Andre was now a seasoned sophomore, still excelling in track and starting to show interest in activism. He joined the school's Diversity Council, a student-led group that organized events and discussions to foster a more inclusive environment. One weekend, he and Alicia walked through the local farmers' market. People smiled and waved, some stopping to express how grateful they were for the changes in the community. A local vendor offered Andre a free smoothie, praising his bravery in speaking up at the forum. Andre shrugged, a slight blush creeping across his cheeks. "I just told my story," he said. Alicia squeezed his shoulder affectionately. "Sometimes that's all it takes. Baby, just tell your story." That same evening, Margaret was among a group of volunteers repainting the gym at the old community center. She hummed as she dipped the roller into a bucket of fresh blue paint, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't known before. She remembered the intense shame she had felt when the story broke. Now, she channeled that shame into positive action. A hush fell as Andre, Alicia, and David walked in to check on the renovation progress. Margaret turned, paint roller in hand, and offered a genuine smile. Andre managed a small smile back. They may never be best friends, but in that moment, they shared a nod of mutual recognition, each acknowledging the other's role in a story that had ultimately galvanized an entire community to examine its conscience. In the months following the community forum, a palpable energy of renewal spread throughout Springdale. The story of how a false 911 call led to a racial reckoning and a deeply transformative journey sparked widespread interest from neighboring towns and even some national media outlets. The local newspaper, the Springdale Gazette, ran an in-depth series entitled "Turning Turmoil into Triumph," how one incident reshaped a town, detailing the policy changes, personal transformations, and community-wide initiatives that followed Margaret's call on Andre Thompson. Under Mayor Alicia Thompson's direction, new policing protocols took root. Officers now participated in quarterly training sessions that went beyond the typical cultural sensitivity checkboxes. Partnering with the local NAACP chapter and a respected consultant from the Department of Justice's Community-Oriented Policing Services COPS program, Springdale's police force implemented interactive workshops on de-escalation, bias recognition, and community engagement. Sergeant Caldwell, in particular, became an advocate for these reforms, often reminding newer recruits, "We're not here just to police, we're here to be part of the community." The results were visible almost immediately. Patrol officers began stopping by local businesses for friendly chats, and during neighborhood events, they offered safety tips and personal introductions instead of just making a stiff, formal appearance. The once disturbing hush that used to fall over a crowd when police arrived gave way to warm greetings and conversations. Even more telling was the creation of a new community advisory council, comprised of local citizens, young and old, who met monthly at City Hall to discuss ongoing issues, large or small. Margaret Holcomb, having gone through a very public reckoning, was one of the first to join. For her, the council served as both a form of atonement and an opportunity to continue learning. Meanwhile, Word of Springdale's progress rippled beyond its borders. Mayors from nearby towns like Fairview Heights and Mapleton reached out to Alicia, requesting advice on launching their own reconciliation programs. The Springdale Gazette documented these exchanges in a weekly column called Bridging the Gap, highlighting stories of how ordinary citizens and local officials worked in tandem to tackle racial biases head-on. Reporters from the street, Louis Post-Dispatch even paid a visit, intrigued by Springdale's success in turning a divisive event into a catalyst for lasting change. Yet, amid the newfound accolades, life still had its challenges for those at the center of it all. Margaret's personal life remained in flux. After losing her real estate job, she struggled to find stable employment, as many employers hesitated once they recognized her name from the news. Nevertheless, she refused to let her circumstances define her. She immersed herself in volunteer work at the youth center, co-facilitating workshops on empathy and conflict resolution. At first, some of the teenagers eyed her with suspicion. They'd seen the viral video of Andre's ordeal, and they knew exactly who Margaret was. But over time, her consistency, her willingness to talk openly about her mistakes, won them over. One afternoon, a teenage girl approached Margaret after a workshop saying, "I appreciate you telling us the truth about what happened. It helps us believe people can really change." Parallel to Margaret's journey, Andre thrived as a newly minted youth leader. Building on his experience in the school's Diversity Council, he organized a year-end charity run to raise funds for the local youth center and an anti-bias training program for educators. With the mayor's office backing him up, he reached out to local businesses like Millie's Bake Shop and the Main Street Bookstore for sponsorships. They responded enthusiastically, donating gift baskets and offering promotional support on social media. Before long, the race was set to take place on the very streets where he'd been stopped by the police months earlier. On race day, the sky seemed impossibly blue, and the entire town buzzed with excitement. Hundreds of participants arrived, wearing brightly colored shirts that read Springdale Unity 5K. Sergeant Caldwell showed up in running shoes, joking that the younger officers would leave him in the dust. Margaret volunteered at the registration booth, handing out numbered bibs and water bottles. Despite the lingering stares from some residents who remembered the story, she did her best to project warmth and humility. She recognized this moment as part of her ongoing atonement, contributing to an event spearheaded by the very teen she had once wronged. When the starting gun went off, Andre sprinted ahead, determined to beat his personal best. He couldn't help but marvel at how the same stretch of asphalt, once symbolized a trauma he feared, might define him forever. Now, it was lined with cheering friends, neighbors, and classmates. Some waved hand-made signs "Go Andre," and unity in action, transforming the landscape into a powerful message of solidarity. In that moment, with his heart pounding and his legs pumping, Andre felt not just relief, but genuine pride in how far he and Springdale had come. After the last runner crossed the finish line, everyone gathered for a small awards ceremony in the newly renovated community park. A stage had been set up under a canopy of oak trees, decorated with balloons and streamers. The crowd fell quiet as Mayor Alicia Thompson took the microphone. In a voice brimming with both emotion and composure, she said, "Today's race stands for more than just competition. It reflects our community's commitment to learning from our past mistakes, my family's personal pain, Margaret's transformation, and the tireless efforts of so many of you here. We've shown that with empathy and determination, we can build a Springdale where everyone feels they belong." She gestured for Andre to join her, and the crowd erupted in applause. Out of the corner of his eye, Andre caught sight of Margaret. Instead of shrinking back, she clapped enthusiastically, tears glistening in her eyes. In that poignant instant, both he and Margaret understood that the rift created by one phone call had begun to mend, perhaps never disappearing fully, but evolving into something far more constructive than either had dreamed possible. To wrap up the celebration, the principal of Thomas Jefferson High took the stage, announcing a new youth mentorship program in conjunction with the police department. High school students would be paired with officers for monthly activities, game nights, cooking classes, and even collaborative art projects. The principal also shared that the Anti-Defamation League and the local chapter of the NAACP had offered additional training resources, ensuring that the seeds of understanding would continue to grow long after the day's festivities. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the park, families packed up picnic blankets, volunteers tidied the staging area, and runners compared times and swapped stories. Laughter and chatter filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that once hovered over these streets. In a way, the transformation felt surreal, like a scene out of a movie in which the townspeople had finally come together after weathering a perfect storm. For many, the Unity Run marked the start of an annual tradition, a living testament to the strides Springdale made. For Margaret, every handshake and smile was a step toward redemption, reminding her that real change requires constant effort but is infinitely worthwhile. And for Andre, the day solidified his resolve to keep using his voice. He had always believed in fairness, but now he understood that change begins when individuals share their stories and stand up even when they're terrified. Thus, Springdale's renewal was not just a fleeting moment, but a lasting movement toward compassion and equity. The town had turned an ugly, frightening episode into a blueprint for progress, inspiring others to take a hard look at their own biases and how they might be harming the people around them. The journey was far from over. After all, real work never ends. But in that shimmering early afternoon light, surrounded by friends and neighbors committed to a better tomorrow, Springdale's future looked immeasurably brighter than it ever had before. By winter, the incident that had once threatened to tear Springdale apart became a catalyst for growth. Old prejudices didn't vanish overnight, but honest conversations began to flourish in living rooms and coffee shops. People questioned their assumptions, reaching out across demographic lines to build genuine connections. Margaret, once vilified, now used her story to educate others about the dangers of unchecked fear. She co-facilitated workshops with a member of the NAACP, illustrating how one impulsive phone call nearly derailed a young man's life and cost her so much in return. Andre continued to excel, both on the track and in the classroom. He channeled his experience into poetry and short stories, some of which were published in the school's literary magazine. Though still carrying emotional scars, he found solace in the knowledge that his voice mattered. He had changed not only his own fate that day, but the course of an entire town. Alicia, for her part, became an even stronger advocate for social justice. She pushed for more inclusive hiring practices at City Hall, increased funding for public schools, and built strong partnerships with local organizations. Her leadership shone as an example of how to turn personal pain into progressive change. And so Springdale, once a typical small town, evolved into a beacon of hope, a place that recognized the power of confronting prejudice head-on. Neighbors who barely acknowledged each other before now shared stories, recipes, and laughter. Police officers walked the streets, interacting warmly with citizens. Block parties, community fairs, and local sporting events became celebrations of unity rather than reminders of division. Every year, on the anniversary of the incident, the community gathered for a special program at the renovated community center, now christened the Thompson Center for Unity and Education. Andre led a talk or read a poem, while Margaret might share her journey of transformation. It became a cherished tradition, symbolizing how an event born of ignorance could blossom into a legacy of understanding, and how even the hardest lessons can pave the way for renewal. Springdale's story reminds us that one impulsive moment can ignite lasting change if we choose to learn from it. Margaret's call to the police on Andre set in motion a chain of events that tested the town's moral core, yet ultimately brought its residents closer. Through honest reflection, accountability, and brave conversations, they confronted biases that threatened to tear them apart. The result? A more unified, empathetic community where citizens stand together against prejudice. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. By spreading messages of hope and transformation, you become part of the ongoing effort to make our world a fairer, more compassionate place for everyone. Let's keep inspiring each other to turn moments of crisis into pathways for unity. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.